And the project I'll be talking about today was together with Insight SFI Research Centre, which is a research centre with a lot of universities in Ireland. And it's also part of the government SFI, which I think has changed now to just Research Ireland. So if you can't find it because of the name change, that might be why. So has anyone heard of dual process theories before coming to this? Okay. Has anyone used it in their paper? Okay. Interesting. So this is a project that just finished about, well, last June. And it was a scoping review of as many studies as I could find doing work on dual process theories and what that meant and what kind of insights we can gain and so on. But before I get into that, I will go to the next slide. Come on. Okay. I'll start with a personal story because Anna recommended I do. So about 8 years ago, I started doing my PhD and I was looking at the topic of motivation and decision making. And for my undergrad and my master's, I was looking at the same topic. So I've kind of built up a knowledge of the area. And by that time, I found specific dual process theories that were really interesting. You probably heard the ones from Kahneman, System 1, System 2, and a few other ones. And after looking through it for a long time, I was like, okay, I've got the lay of the land. I understand these theories. I know how they work, so I can use them in my thesis. But then 1 year into the PhD, I just happened to stumble across this one paper talking about model-free and model-based processing. And I realized then, oh, this is a dual process theory, but it's coming from a computational angle. And all of the theories I've looked at before were coming from judgment and decision-making and biases and more of a cognitive angle. And it was really interesting because it was basically saying the same things, but looking at it from a different view, using different methodologies, having like different predictions and so on, using a lot more around reinforcement learning algorithms, using those to predict the kind of behavior people would do, then measuring what behavior people do and seeing if it matches back to those algorithms. So it was really a new angle to look at everything. And I think it made my thesis a lot better because I was able to kind of bring all these new factors into it. But then 3 months later, I found a new theory. 2 months later, another theory. And it just kept happening and happening and happening, where every new area I'd look into had their own theory, not just one, like 7. So it felt like I could never find the end of it, which I felt was a real problem when you're trying to fit everything into a thesis. But even for general research, you kind of don't want that kind of problem where half of the research you're looking for is hidden somewhere else because they're using different terms. So one thing I want to highlight is the importance of theory. This has been highlighted by more influential people than me. So if you want to actually learn about the importance of theory, you can listen to Meckler's talk or Hornbeck's talk that were also UCLIC seminars, so they're on YouTube. But I'm going to focus more on the dual process theory side of things. But just as a recap, a lot of researchers are saying at the moment that HCI has application of theory that's really quite shallow, and really kind of appropriate use of theory is in decline. There's the idea that if you don't have a theory, it basically creates a vacuum where it just invites speculation because you don't have any framework to surround the kind of ideas that you're discovering. I think Hornbeck and Ulla-Vista are saying that it's a constructive force that links antecedents and outcomes. The creators of self-determination theory like to think of it as a way to connect phenomena that otherwise would just exist as a nice list of interesting facts. Instead, you bring kind of a convergent proof of a mechanism under effect. So what are dual process theories? The idea of having kind of a divide or 2 types of thinking or 2 modes of thinking is actually quite old in research terms. So we have a paper here from 1905 from William James talking about how 2 minds can know one thing. Kind of more popular versions started up in 1977 and 1974. But even Freud, I think in the 1800s, was talking about primary and secondary processes. So it's really an idea that keeps coming up over and over again. So for the people that didn't put their hand up saying that they knew what dual process theories are, I'll give a quick introduction. So I think the easiest one to think about is what's called type 2 model-based controlled systematic, and there's lots of names for it. But this is the type of active mental effort that you would put into understanding something, creating predictions. You put your working memory resources into something, all your attention. All of these things would be type 2 thinking. So it's kind of highly adaptable in that if you learn something in one context, you can adapt it to a different context. It's generalizable. And it lets you create predictions for the future. So in an instance, if you're playing chess, you can imagine several moves ahead. And you can think about, okay, if I move here, the opponent will move here. So you can see the outcomes of your actions without actually having to take those actions in the first place. So it's kind of a predictive model of the future. So model-based. Then the other option is type 1 model-free automatic heuristic. And this is believed to be kind of a more not animalistic, but it kind of first developed in animals and people as opposed to this type of thinking. And it's more fast, it's efficient, it's mostly automatic. It's sometimes outside of conscious awareness. And a lot of the time it feels like you're offloading kind of your thinking onto some other part of yourself. So if you're learning how to drive, let's say, at the start, you kind of have to look at the pedals, you have to think really hard about everything you're doing. But then after, I don't know, personally, it took a while, but after 6 months or so, you kind of get used to it. I still don't like talking to people while I'm driving, but I'll get over that. But it's something that eventually becomes automatic so that you can have a philosophical conversation with your participant. You can listen to the radio, not participant, sorry, your passenger. You can listen to the radio, you can do other things while you're driving. So those are the two types of thinking. But one thing to remember is that most behaviors are too complex to either be type 1 or type 2. Mostly there's a kind of a hybrid approach where they work together very collaboratively, sometimes in conflict, but mostly they work together. So one of the common critiques of dual process theories is that behavior isn't one thing or another. It's usually kind of complex. And I agree with them. But there are a lot of researchers that tend to fall on this pitfall of binary thinking where something has to be one or the other. But an example would be, let's say you're a chess grandmaster. I don't know if you've seen that study, but there's a study about chess grandmasters compared to amateurs. And they look at if I put all of the pieces on the board, how well are you able to remember the position of all those pieces? And if you're a grandmaster, you can remember them kind of nearly 100% of the time where every piece is. Whereas if you're an amateur, it's usually around 25% of the pieces, something like that. But this was pieces in a position where they would be in a real chess game. If you then make it random positions where having prior knowledge as a chess grandmaster would have no benefit, then they are pretty equal. So it shows that chess grandmasters, yes, they're using time 2 thinking of like, what will I do this move ahead? But they're also using all of this learned memory of what it means to have all these pieces together. And that's all chunked up into one name, like the Queen's Gambit or something. And then that's how you know what to choose from. You know, I don't play chess, but I'm using it as that. So a question for everyone. I kind of gave the game away a little bit at the start, but how many dual process theories do you think there are? Not only HCI, and all of research. Yeah. So personally, in my scoping review of HCI, there was at least 42 theories. And for the ones that most people have heard of, it'll probably be Petty-Cachopo with elaboration likelihood model, maybe heuristic systematic model from Scheichen, system 1, system 2 from Kahneman and Stanovich, or type 1 and type 2, which is what I'm using most frequently at the moment. But you probably heard other things like automatic and controlled with Schneider and Schiffin, or I don't know, input models and higher cognition. Like there's so many of them. So you might have heard them already and not even know they're a dual process theory, because really only 10% of papers actually say it, that the theory they're working in is dual process. So you might be thinking, why are there so many? How could they all appear out of nowhere and say the same thing, but not talk to each other at all? And I've been asking myself that for a long time, but I'll try and give an example. So around the 1970s and 1980s, there was a lot of research around persuasion and attitude change. And it was research around, okay, we're giving people these messages, and some messages are really convincing because they're logical and consistent. Some of them are less so. But that's not necessarily predictive of what people will believe. Maybe the most logical and consistent message is not always believed, and kind of really poor arguments are sometimes believed for reasons completely outside of the message. And there were so many inconsistent findings that Fishbin and Eisen at the time said that the research was an accumulation of largely inconsistent findings with few, if any, generalizable principles of effective communication, which I feel is a bad place to be in terms of research. So first we have Richard Petty, who developed the elaboration likelihood model. And this one here. And these numbers are, if you go to the paper, those are the references. And I'll give you a QR code for the paper at the end. But they created the idea of dual processing, where if you look at the message and you consider it on its merits, you think about it deeply, logic, consistency, it's called the central route of processing. And if you consider peripheral things like, I don't know, how attractive the speaker is, or the number of arguments, not necessarily how good they are, that would be a peripheral route of processing. So one requires high elaboration and one requires low elaboration. Petty talks about what factors change your likelihood of using high elaboration compared to low elaboration. And that was a good theory. It got really popular in those circles. But even so, at a similar time, Shelley Shaken, I hope I pronounced that right, in the 1980s, had a similar idea where they saw the same research, the same inconsistencies, and said, okay, sometimes you think heuristically, habitually, and so on. You don't consider the message on its merits, and sometimes you think systematically, and you do consider the message on its merits, and created the heuristic systematic model. So both of them developed at the same time. They're all nearly always talked about together. And I think one of the reasons that they're popular is because if you talk about this one, you always talk about this one. So it's like they bring each other up in the research. But I think another reason is that this one stayed in persuasion literature, and this one kind of broadened out to more generalized context. So then people in these papers will usually say, okay, we have a dualistic type of thinking that follows these kind of rules. And if we're looking at persuasion and messaging context, this model will tell you how likely it is that they use one of those systems. So it's kind of used in tandem, even though they both say the same things. Then at the same time, in the judgment and decision-making research, which was around the 2000s, 12 different theories had popped up at the same time, trying to explain logical reasoning and biases that were seen in participants at the time. So one of the problems they were trying to get their head around is called the Linda problem. Who has here heard of the Linda problem before? Just one, okay. So let's see if you can get it. Linda is a 31-year-old, single, outspoken, and very bright. She majored in philosophy. As a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice, and also participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. Which is more probable? Linda is a bank teller, or Linda is a bank teller and is active in the feminist movement. So who thinks it's A? Okay, and who thinks it's B? Okay, less. So you might think, okay, Linda seems like a feminist, so I'm going to pick the option that has feminist in it. But if you look at it from a probability theory, this is an example of the conjunction fallacy, where if someone is a bank teller and active in the women's movement, that is a conjunction of two groups. It means that everyone in this group also has to be a bank teller, but everyone that is a bank teller doesn't have to be active in the women's group. So out of all the groups, bank tellers is bigger than the conjunction. So therefore, bank teller has to be more probable. So she could have all these things, but she's not active in the feminist movement because she has a child and doesn't have time or something like that. So there's a lot of options in here that also include all the options in here. So that's an example of a kind of bias that people found. I know there's problems with these. I'm not going to question them right now. But that's one of the example of the biases people found, and they were like, all right, how do we explain this? We thought that humans were rational actors. This is an example of them being irrational for various reasons. And why is that the case? One thing I found interesting is that early versions of ChatGPT also fell for the conjunction fallacy, but recent versions do not. So even if I change to John and solicitor and so on, they highlight that it is a conjunction fallacy, and that because of probability theory, A is more likely, which I thought was interesting. Okay, so because of these things like the Linda problem, people started making reasons as to why these biases are inherent in how people make decisions. Around 12 different theories became popular at the time. So Stanovich and West in 2001 created what's called a prototypical view of dual process theories in judgment and decision-making research. And because he was doing a prototypical view, he didn't want to take a stand on what to call it and so on. So he called it, or they called it, System 1 and System 2, which is generic on purpose, but also very hard to remember. Then later on, I think around the 2010s, Evans tried to bring back the terms type 1 and type 2 processing, because the terms system 1 and system 2 imply that there's one system that controls everything, whereas it's much more likely that the type of processing you see happens throughout the brain in different areas, and different areas may be in charge of one thing, and sometimes they're called in, sometimes they're not. So Evans calls it an autonomous set of systems as opposed to as one system. So it's easier to say type 1 and type 2. But even though cognitive science has kind of moved to type 1 and type 2, HCI research has not. So if you're trying to find dual process research, you're going to have to stick with system 1 and system 2 as terms. Okay, so we know the problem. There's a lot of theories. We want to bring theories into HCI, but how do we choose which dual process theory to use? So that's why I decided to do a scoping review. So not only understand how much is our dual process theories being used in HCI, but where, how, all of these things. And then once I understand all of that, hopefully, if you're someone like me doing the PhD at first, I can showcase all the current work that's been done, and you can see, okay, these are the different theories that are relevant to me, these are the ones that aren't, and I don't have to keep searching over and over again and finding new things. And then lastly, I want to give some like key takeaways, some things I found like misapplications, misattributions, and so on to highlight to people. So just some methodology to get out of the way. As a limitation, I couldn't search all of the conferences and journals, so I stuck to these ones specifically. So if you did dual process theory research and you don't find it on the scoping review, it might be because it's not one of these journals or conferences. So one of the big problems was searching for these theories, right? Because you might think, okay, I want all dual process theories. I'll search dual process theory, dual system theory, two system theory, all of these. And hopefully I'll get everything, right? No, you only get about 10% using that. So then I thought, okay, every theory has two terms. So maybe I'll search both terms. So system 1, system 2, automatic, controlled, heuristic, systematic, all of those terms. But specifically automatic, controlled, hot, cold, very common words. You get a lot of stuff you don't want back. I actually got, I think it was 70% of all the ACM digital extended library back when using those terms. So I had to make a choice and say, okay, I'll have these conditions. And it's like, if you are automatic and conscious processing, then that's from the theory from Barg and Chartrand. So you should technically have some reference to those if you're talking about that. Or if it's Bazerman and Tambruzo, you want the one self and should self. So there's a lot of conditional statements I had to add, and that made a way more manageable amount of studies to look into. I'll skip through this because it's not really that relevant, but we had about 1,900 studies. We took out duplicates, ones that weren't actually talking about dual process theories, that weren't from the list of conferences or journals we wanted. And we got a final number of 512 for the description of what dual process theories are being used, how are they being used, and so on. And then I wanted to actually look at implications as well, understand better how they're being used. Are they being used in kind of the methods of the study or just in the discussion and things like that? So we took it down to 85 that were more likely to have that kind of information as well. So I'll have results from this, and they'll be kind of separate. So the first thing I want to know is, are they actually being used? Is it popular in HCI? And yes, they are more popular than they were before. I had a reviewer ask, well, maybe absolute numbers of papers in HCI are going up, so that's why it's going up. And I checked that too, and it went from like 0.2% to between 1.7 in some journals to 4.6 in some other journals. So it's definitely going up. I wonder if that's COVID that did that, but 2018, maybe not. But that's an interesting dip. And then let's look at the breakdown by theory. So first we have controlled and automatic kind of being used exclusively. Then for some reason in 2005 to 7, the elaboration likelihood model took off. In 2011, when Kahneman published Thinking Fast and Slow, I think that's when System 1 and System 2 took off. Yeah, because there's no yellow before that. And now the more popular one seems to be elaboration likelihood model, heuristic and systematic, and System 1 and System 2. And then here we have others, which also seems to be going up. So I think people are referencing even more theories that maybe I haven't heard of, or just different or more specific to the certain context there. But if we look over time, it looks like the only twos that are really going up are elaboration likelihood model, heuristic, and System 1 and System 2, even though I feel like type 1 and type 2 should be more than this one, but what can you do? And then other is also going up. So it looks like the problem is getting bigger and that people keep using different theories. I'll just quickly highlight that the one that looked at these theories the most by far was computers and human behavior. So if you're looking to publish or want to find papers on dual process theory, probably go there first. But Chi is second, so maybe we can get dual process theories to be in more conferences as well, when relevant, of course. So the areas of research that, if you're doing any research in these areas, you might find dual process theories relevant and interesting. I'm not going to go through explaining all of them because it's all in the paper with kind of examples and descriptions and all of these. But I'll just give a quick highlight. So if you're doing behavior change or have self-control, nudging, dark patterns, gamification, these are the types of things where dual process theories has been used successfully. If you're looking at any cognitive mechanisms like attention, memory, cognitive load, all very relevant as well. If you're looking at information quality and dissemination, so misinformation and disinformation, which is very big right now with social media accounts, that's also very relevant. Impression formation, credibility, all have a lot of studies that use dual process theories in interesting ways, sometimes well, sometimes not. Group attitudes and stereotypes, we have things like online harassments, gender stereotypes for robots, things like that. And the last group is machine learning and agent interactions, which are like recommender systems, explainable AI, things like that. If you have any interest to look into any of those areas, as I said, please do look in the paper. And if we have time at the end, I might explain one or two studies. So then after I gave kind of the lay of the land of dual process theories, I wanted to delve in and find some of the contributions, implications, audiences, things that might be interesting. And so I followed Hornbeck and Burkle's implications in HCI taxonomy, just to kind of highlight a few things that HCI researchers really care about in terms of dual process theory. So obviously theory was the most popular one. We're looking at dual process theory. People are going to talk about how this has implications for theory, contributions for theory. How can we improve dual process theories from our knowledge? Although something that Merkel has been talking about, how people will use the theory but never push back against the theory. I found that as well. Like if you found something that didn't match, they'd be like, oh, maybe there was a problem with the study. And if you found something that does match, okay, this matches the theory, so then it's therefore correct. Things like that. Or sometimes, because of their methods, they'll say, oh, this is aligned with the theory. And when I'm reading it, I'm like, it does not, but okay. Then we have design. Everyone probably knows design because sometimes you'll get reviewers saying, what are the design implications? And you have to put that into your paper. But that is very popular as well. Things like design factors, design of apps, and how that is affected by habitual processing or model-free processing and so on. And that's kind of UX, UI industry focus. We had a lot of practical ones, so understanding kind of cybersecurity related decisions in the workplace and so on. And that, like, it was relevant in that instance. We had a good few papers talking about the methodology. So what can we use to test certain things? Can we use self-report measures reliably? Things like that. Less so society, but you can see how kind of cues of credibility on ideological sites can be interesting on a societal scale. And then policy and HCI community were not very well looked at all in terms of dual process theory. But other researchers have said that HCI in general doesn't focus a lot on these two. But if you were to put my scoping review, I guess in one of these, it would be HCI community. Okay, so what's the key takeaway that you should take from this presentation? I think we need to have a standard. So as I said, we have problems with lack of definite names. So Kahneman's system 1, system 2 theory. I don't want to have to search a theory by the contents of the theory. I want to have a name to search for. So it's really hard to find papers if you don't use a definite name. So that's why I think that's likely why elaboration likelihood model is so popular, because it has a name. Lack of unique terms. So if you're using hot and cold, it's very hard for other researchers to find you. So you're going to have that problem that I had in my research, where someone's doing research that's so relevant to you, uses the same methods, is looking at the same kind of things, but you don't even know about each other because you're using different terms. Then we had papers like this one here that would just pick their own terms. So they would call it controlled and intuitive. And even though there's 42 theories, none of them use that combination of controlled and intuitive. So please don't do that. So what can we do? General terms like system 1 and system 2 are too general. You can have type 1 and type 2 diabetes. You can have system 1 and system 2 and like a algorithm test about AI. So what should we do? So the one thing, if you are doing research on dual process theories, please say dual process theories in the paper. And then I found that there are dual process theories not related to cognition. So dual process theories of cognition, please add that in your paper. That's the one thing, if you walk away from here today, please do that if you do any dual process theory research. Something that would also help if you want your study to get seen by a lot of different audiences is to provide a small introduction of what dual process theories of cognition are. So not only will that tell all your readers that dual process theories exist, which is good for them to know that the theory you're using is part of a bigger whole that has a lot of context that you can add from other theories. But it also gives you the opportunity to mention the most popular ones. So you can talk about elaboration likelihood model, you can talk about heuristic systematic model. And not only will that give context to the reader, but it also means that your paper is more likely to be seen. And that means that we can come together as a community to create a broad scientific theory that we can push forward and evolve in unison, as opposed to doing it all piecemeal all over the place. And just a few considerations that I found interesting from looking at all these papers are some kind of things like the binary misconception, how people may not use appropriate methodology, and that I think dual process theories could be an interesting broad scientific theory. So one problem that we have with a lot of researchers that I found in the literature is that there's a general belief that only one type of processing occurs at one time. So either someone is making a decision solely through type 1 or solely through type 2, and that's why that happened. And something that overflows from that is researchers believing that there are environmental factors or cues that only promote one type of thinking. So you'll have researchers that will say, well, we changed the peripheral cue on this experiment, And when we change that, the behavior changed. So that must mean the behavior changed because of peripheral processing. And that's not always the case. So let's try and give an example, hopefully not too controversial. So here we have a tweet from the CDC that says, the drug ivermectin is not authorized or approved for treating COVID, and it can be bad for you, basically. So in terms of cues, the central processing cue would be the content of the tweet, and the peripheral cue would be that it was posted by the CDC, that there's a tick, the number of followers the CDC has, the number of likes, retweets, comments, and so on. Now, you might be thinking, okay, the content is important, but I wouldn't necessarily trust the content if it was just some random account. So why is the random account considered a peripheral cue, even though it's technically relevant? And I agree with you. So that's one of the reasons why, even when people were first creating these theories in the 1970s and so on, they said that cues often have multiple and sometimes conflicting effects. So you can't just assume, oh, we're looking at source expertise, and source expertise is not technically part of the message. Then people who take source expertise into account are only doing so because they're using automatic processing. I would say that's not the case, because if you have digital literacy, you want to check, okay, the source expertise will tell me something about whether the message is true, because I don't have time to read all papers on ivermectin, I guess. And even then, you'd have to use the source expertise of the authors of that paper unless you did your own research. So I find that labeling these cues as peripheral cues really isn't useful. And even the creators of the theory had example papers that they did on it. So you might say source attractiveness is not a relevant factor, but if someone is advertising beauty products, you might say, okay, true or false, if someone is attractive and they're advertising the beauty product, it could be the case that they use the beauty product. Putting that question up would be type 2 processing, even though you might eventually go, okay, they probably just get paid. It doesn't matter if they don't probably actually use the thing, but it would still be a peripheral cue that's affecting you. Source expertise, as I already said, there was another paper that found that blue paper causes people to use more systematic thinking for whatever reason. So these are the kind of things that can affect people in unknown ways, and still it's not a peripheral cue or a central cue. And then I found a lot of examples of binary misconception and action in some of the papers where they would categorize variables like number of followers, expertise, so on, as either a peripheral or a central cue. Then they would use these as proxy measurements of peripheral or central processing, type 1 or type 2 processing, and then they would try to predict online behaviors, and then they would say, okay, if a post has a large number of followers and the number of followers is a peripheral cue, that means people are processing peripherally the number of followers, and that's why posts are viral, as opposed to posts are viral if they have a lot of followers because it goes in front of a lot of people. Like, you don't have to do all of this proxy management around it. So one of the things I've found a lot in the papers is kind of definitive statements like this, where you say information embedded in the text is centrally processed. Information associated with text attributes such as reviewer traits is heuristically processed. And I think if you say stuff like that, you're pushing a narrative that's not necessarily true, when you're kind of conflating results when sometimes that's not the case. Another thing I think is important to remember is about the use of process-appropriate methodology. So what I mean by this is that type 1 processing, automatic, heuristic, this type of thinking, because it usually occurs outside of conscious awareness, that means that you as a person don't have metacognitive awareness of that behavior, what happened underneath, so you can't really report on what happened. And a lot of studies have noticed that because of this lack of metacognitive awareness, there's a high tendency for confabulation. So what that means is that you're just giving your best guess. It's as if you have two people driving the car and you see the car turn, and the first guy knows he turned to avoid a pedestrian or something, and the second guy wasn't particularly paying attention. So then you ask them, why did the car turn? And then they're like, I don't know, because they wanted to. Like maybe the route was this way. So it really shows that because we don't have that awareness, we're basically just guessing. So maybe self-report measures are not the best way to get content around this area. So one example is there was a study where they showed participants a picture of two faces, just different people, and they would ask them, which one do you prefer? Which one do you think is more attractive? And then they'd pick one, and then show another two faces, and they'd pick one, and so on. And then later on, they'd come back and say, okay, you picked this specific face. Why did you pick this one? And the person would say, oh, they reminded me of my friend, or they looked really charismatic when I first saw them, or I really liked how they were dressed, and it reminded me of my own clothes, and I think I'm well dressed, and so on. And then in the end, a lot of those pictures were not the pictures they had picked. They were placed in there as like red herrings to be like, okay, can you notice that you didn't actually pick this picture? And instead of noticing, they confabulated reasons as to why they picked that picture. So that is known to happen a lot in self-report measuring. Kevin Doherty did a really good paper on self-report measures and all of the kind of inconsistencies and details that are important when using these kind of measures. So if you are using retrospective self-reports, do consider that the experience and the thinking that you have at one point is not necessarily aware of everything that happened at another point. So you'd have to take that into consideration whenever you're doing those kind of studies. Another issue is that in those studies, like I was saying, where they'd use number of followers as a way to create peripheral or automatic or habitual processing, it's a very distance way to produce that kind of processing. So then if you say, all right, we produce that kind of processing, so anything that happens after this is a result of that production, you can't really say that. But there are reliable methods of inducing the two types of processing. Like one of them works quicker, so if you limit time, one of them needs your working memory resources, so if you limit cognitive load, like there are techniques that you can use to at least get closer to a position where you can say, okay, I know that this type of processing is responsible for this or not. So it's much better to use those types instead of using proxy measures. And then sometimes you might get conflicting results, and that doesn't mean that there's an issue with your measurement. It means that there are conflicting things being processed by the participant that create these different results. So there was one study where students either studied in a cafeteria or lunchroom, or studied in a library, and then they were tested for retention, memory engagement, all those things. And students, at least in this study, preferred and said that they were better at remembering things when they studied in the lunchroom and the cafeteria, assumedly because like they could talk to friends and so on, and it was an enjoyable activity. Whereas, but they still thought that they remembered better in that environment. Whereas if you really tested them, they actually remembered better and had more engagement and so on in a library setting. So that's an instance where a person feels and explains and reports on one thing, but if you actually look at it in terms of raw metrics, it's another. But it doesn't mean that the metrics don't tell you something, or it doesn't mean that the people are wrong. It just means that there are two systems saying different things inside of them too. So it's not your tests that are wrong. The people are doing two things at once. And then the last thing I want to say is around a challenge we had for a good few years now from Kostakos about having broad scientific theories that we can bring and apply our research to, as opposed to chasing trends, jumping from topic to topic, as they say. And we know that Meckler and Hornbach and so on talked about shallow application, theoretical posturing, using theory merely as a discussion point. And that's something I found as well. And the research I was looking at, a lot of theories would they would do something that they found interesting, and then at the end, to explain their results, they would say, okay, well, maybe this happened because dual process theory says this, as opposed to using it as something that you make predictions for, and then whether you are right or wrong, you understand more about not only the theory, but also the mechanism behind it and so on. So that's one thing I would push for as well. And really, the idea here is that dual process theories are in what Kostakos call a transversal phase because of the misapplication, the disparity in terms, theoretical misconceptions. And hopefully, if we do some of the things I've been talking about today, we can create a more broad scientific theory that can push us forward. And then if you want to read the preprint of the paper, you can go here. Thank you.
Great. So are there already some questions? So at the beginning, you or in the middle somewhere, you said if we have time, you might be able to present some of the studies that you found.
Yeah.
And I would be interested in how people have appropriately applied the theory in their studies.
Yeah.
And not just have done it post hoc, let's say. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, no problem. So one example I took was this paper called Type Out. So what they did is they got participants that said that they had certain apps that they don't want to visit frequently throughout the day. And they made these people think about they think about what they wanted out of their actions whenever they're using their phone. And the people would say something like, I value self-control. And why is it important to me in my life? And so I will use my phone less and stay in focus more. So people would kind of fill these in and tell us about why they wanted to use, let's say, Facebook, Twitter, and so on less. And they found that if you, just as you're about to open that certain app, you remind that person, okay, remember that you made this decision that you didn't want to use this app. That would be targeting people's type 2 systematic thinking. You're kind of convincing them, remember when you said this? This is a logical behavior based on your intention. People still open the apps as much as they want. Then we had another one that's called typing only. In this example, there's this idea where if you open an app that is hedonically useful, so something like Facebook, well, maybe not Facebook anymore, something like TikTok, where you open that and as soon as you open it, you're laughing, you're sending it to friends, you feel good. There's like a conditioning happening at play here where you do a behavior, you get rewarded, you want to do that behavior again. That's the type of targeting you do for type 1 processing, for automatic habitual processing. So the idea here is to add a sort of barrier, a disruption point, and this disruption point where you have to put in random numbers, like write out 7, 5, 1, is a way to kind of hijack this process so that you'll fall out of it and you'll think, okay, why am I actually doing this? You have time for your analytic processing to remind you, okay, this isn't what I want. So that's another technique. So this one targets type 2, systematic. This one targets type 1. And yes, this one worked better, but actually the one that worked the best was using both of them together. So with this one, people were like, okay, yeah, I did say that, but not today. With this one, they were like, oh, okay, this is less enjoyable, but it's also frustrating. I don't like this app anymore. Whereas this one was, I want to do it. I understand why I'm doing this. So it's both frustrating in that it stops your type 1 processing, but it also reminds you of your type 2 processing. So both of them working together had the most beneficial effects, where the frequency of use for the target apps was significantly lower than the other ones. So that's an example of saying, okay, I'm going to target one system, I'm going to target another system, but I'm also going to target both systems. And actually targeting both systems was the best way to go forward.
Cool, thank you. I think there was a question online.
Yeah.
Yes, the question is from Duncan Bramley. So he says, essentially, it's about the value judgment inferred from how researchers make light touch references, that somehow using a reference to deeply engage with a theory is a true use of theory. He argues that a light touch citation shows that you found a deep truth, something that is true and broadly resonates, and that's valuable, he says. What do you think about this?
So he's saying that if you find a reference that's relevant to your paper as like a theory, and then you say, okay, that's probably why it worked because this theory said so, He's saying that's a valuable.
Yes, in my understanding, yes.
Okay, I would disagree. I would say if we only do research about things that we find interesting and then use theory later on to just explain it, it's one of those things where you can find any theory to explain anything. So you're not really explaining your theory and you're not really explaining the results. You're just looking for theories that explain your results, as opposed to finding out why your results are true, deciding if you do this experiment in this way, I'll know for certain that this part of the theory is not predictive of the truth, or it is predictive of the truth. And then at the end, not only do you know of the effects that are happening, okay, participants will do this in this context, but you also know this theory works in this context, or it doesn't work in this context. Whereas if you do something like measure this, but you did it from your own free will without bringing theory into it, and then later on you say, oh, it probably worked because type 1 is here and type 2 is here. Okay, it worked, so you used that theory, but if it didn't work, you would have used a different theory, and you would have said, okay, that makes sense because self-determination theory says that this is crowding out your internal motivation, so that's why that didn't work. So you're explaining every result with a theory as opposed to learning more about theories with your results. Does that make sense? Yeah.
You mentioned the experiment like earlier. Hi, thank you for the talk. It was great. Now that I have a mic, I can speak properly. To follow up on that, so my thought was, all right, I remember sitting in lectures of qualitative methods, and we're like, one of the ways to justify the kind of reliability, validity, like, you know, how do you do it when it's interview data, is to link it back to theory. So this is what I thought is acceptable, to actually link it back to theory in your discussion section if you are dealing with more kind of like interview data. So I was just wondering, because you mentioned if you have an experiment, do you think it's the same for experiments and for also like more sort of exploratory observational findings where you just want to explore what's going on, and then you're thinking, oh, maybe that's explained by this theory, and future research can test that because we have this idea right now?
Yeah, so I think there's definitely is a difference. So with exploratory research, you're actively looking at things to better understand what's the general gist of what's happening, right? You're not trying to prove anything, you're just trying to get a view of the land, so you can think, okay, these are the predictions being made over here, these are the things that seem to be true over here. Then you can later go on, at least my view is that you can later go on and test it in certain ways and be like, okay, that turns out to be true, that turns out to be false. So with that, you can describe all the different theories, what they think and so on, and you can bring it in because you're not testing anything out, you're just giving a description of things as they are, as opposed to being prescriptive. Whereas with something like this, I would say, because you're trying to test something out, not only are you interested in what the result is, as in, I want to reduce how people use this, their target apps, you're also interested in understanding why that happens. Because if you test it out and you find out that this works because there's a prediction in the theory that says that people, if you put something in between this timing and so on, then you can do that again and again in different generalized contexts. You don't have to test out this type of theory in every single context there is, and say, okay, it works in this context. You can generalize and say, this is a theory that works when it does this, and then you can apply it throughout the land, so to speak. So I think one of the problems that HCI has is that they will use novelty as a way to explore something that appears to work in this context to see if it works in this context, and saying, okay, that's novel because it also works in this context, but you're never explaining why it works. You're never learning more about how people make decisions. You're just creating a list of interesting contexts where this works, which I think is a problem. Whereas if you had a theory, then you can learn more about theory, learn more about how the world works, and then you can make predictions that are actually useful. Does that make sense? Thank you.
Do you think the kind of problems that we're interested in HCI are... So I asked this as someone who used to use a lot of theory and hasn't touched any theory in many, many years. Do you think the types of problems that we're trying to address, or the phenomena we're trying to explore, are really that compatible? Are there many psychological theories that have measurable effect sizes in the kinds of context that we're interested in, the kinds of problems that we're interested in. So my experience of applying theory is either you do a good job of theory testing or you have a good applied context, and you can't manage to do both of those things. And either way, half your reviewers are not going to be happy with you.
Yeah.
So I guess my question with this, like you said earlier in the talk, that most of the time people are using both systems in tandem.
Yeah.
Right. And that means messy results.
Yeah.
Right. Because that's down to people's strategic choices and how they decide to approach the task and all sorts of other things you can't then control.
Mm-hmm.
That problem is exacerbated, made worse, the more you try the ecological validity, right? The closer the more you try and ape, some kind of reality, the messier that gets, the more the strategic space expands, the harder it is to pin people down. And then your results don't make any sense, right? You can't find that. So I guess the question is, do you think it's out of a kind of sloth that this is happening, or is it more down to the fact that actually the kinds of studies you need to run to get good quality results, decent effects, reliable effects are not really compatible with the kinds of problems we're looking at in HCI? Like E prime, great, works great. Trying to understand how office workers do this.
Yeah.
Effect size is so negligible in the grand scheme of everything else that's happening, is not actually useful. It has no explanatory power in that context. So I don't know what you think about that.
Thanks. It's an interesting question, and it brings about loads of different things to mind. So one of the things I think about is kind of the nudging research that people use, and they apply policy to that, and then they say, okay, does this work? Can we reduce something like littering in a location? So they'll say, okay, nudging research says this, so we'll put up this sign. And a lot of the times you can tell that they are just basing it off some different list of examples as opposed to having a theory that explains it. And a lot of the time it backfires. So they don't actually understand that having a sign that says something like you should stay indoors and mask straight after the prime minister was in a party will have the opposite effect than your intended effect. So I think it's fine. Like these theories came up out of a world where people were saying, this keeps happening when this happens. This keeps happening when this happens. And it created an environment where then people could come in and bring a theory to explain it. And I think that's fine if we are in a new area, but I think there's a lot of things that people are talking about that do have these theories, but people are just saying, I think this is interesting. I'm interested in ChatGPT, so I'm just going to jump in and research ChatGPT. And then at the very end, they'll be like, okay, this theory kind of aligns with this. And I think if you do it that way, where you use your theory to confirm your results at the end, is the fact that you have a lot of evidence for theories that I don't think are necessarily true, but I think they are so well cited that people take them as true, because every third study will say, well, this happened and that kind of aligns with what this theory says, so this theory must be true. And as Meckler was saying with self-determination theory that she was looking at? Yeah. None of these studies, even when they get different results on one part of the paper, but aligning results on the other part of the paper, will ever start to question self-determination theory, because it's been so thoroughly proven by all these other studies that they'll say, okay, this matches this part of the self-determination theory. This actually matches another part of the self-determination theory if we look at it this way. So I think there are problems, as you said, that necessarily theory might not apply, and we can create interesting discussions around what results we're finding out of that. But I think a little bit is people going after things they're interested in and then don't have time to look at what theory actually would explain all of this. And I don't think that's an individual issue. I think systemically we don't have enough money, enough time, all of that. So I'm not going to blame people for doing this. But I will blame you if you try and prove your results from theories you've just looked at once, and that's your little reference, and you're like, okay, that's why this theory is correct and my work is correct.
Are there any other questions? Otherwise, this would have been a nice final word too. Anyone? Okay, then let's thank our speaker again.